Everyone at the concert was happy at the beginning, but Tommy was different. He was just crying. No one knew why the child was crying until Elvis put down the microphone and got off the stage. The truth learned at that moment would shock everyone. It was supposed to be just another magical evening in Memphis, Tennessee. The year was 1974, and Elvis Presley was at the height of his fame, drawing thousands of fans to every performance. The massive auditorium buzzed with excitement as 15,000 people filled every seat, their voices creating a symphony of anticipation. But among all those excited faces, one small figure stood out for all the wrong reasons. 9-year-old Tommy Richardson sat in the front row, tears streaming down his cheeks as the opening act finished. While everyone around him clapped and cheered, Tommy remained silent, his small shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Tommy wasn't supposed to be there that night. Just 3 months earlier, his life had been completely different. He lived in a small house on the outskirts of Memphis with his father, Robert Richardson, a hard-working mechanic who struggled to make ends meet after Tommy's mother had passed away when he was just 5 years old. Robert had one passion that he shared with his son, Elvis Presley's music. Every evening after work, Robert would sit in his old armchair and play Elvis records on their scratched turntable. Tommy would curl up beside him, and together they would listen to Can't Help Falling in Love, Love Me Tender, and Hound Dog. Those were the happiest moments of Tommy's young life. His father's rough hands would gently pat his head as Elvis's voice filled their modest living room, creating a bubble of warmth and love that made all their struggles seem bearable. "One day, Tommy," Robert would say, his voice filled with hope, "we're going to see the king perform live. I promise you that." It was a promise that Robert desperately wanted to keep, but money was always tight. Still, Robert kept saving, putting aside whatever spare change he could find, hiding it in an old coffee tin on the kitchen shelf. But life has a way of changing everything in an instant. On a rainy Tuesday morning in October, Robert Richardson was working under a customer's car when the jack slipped. The massive vehicle crushed him instantly, taking away Tommy's father, his protector, and his best friend all at once. Tommy was at school when it happened. He remembered being called to the principal's office, seeing the sad faces of the adults around him, and hearing words that didn't make sense. "Accident," they said. "Gone," they whispered. "So sorry," they repeated. But Tommy couldn't understand. How could his father be gone? They had plans. They were going to see Elvis together. They were supposed to listen to records that evening, just like they always did. The funeral was a blur of black clothes and whispered condolences. Social workers came with clipboards talking about foster care and new arrangements. Everything was changing so fast that Tommy felt like he was drowning in a world that no longer made sense. Tommy's salvation came in the form of Mrs. Margaret Henderson, a kind-hearted woman in her 60s who had been Robert's neighbor for over a decade. She had watched Tommy grow up and couldn't bear the thought of the boy disappearing into the foster care system. Mrs. Henderson wasn't wealthy, living on a modest pension, but she had something more valuable than money. She had love to give and a determination to honor Robert's memory by caring for his son. The legal process took weeks, but finally, Tommy moved into Mrs. Henderson's small apartment. She did her best to make him feel at home, but Tommy remained distant and quiet. He barely spoke, barely ate, and spent most of his time staring out the window as if waiting for his father to come walking up the street. Nothing seemed to work until one day she found him holding one of his father's old Elvis records that he had managed to save. That's when she remembered Robert's promise and hatched a plan that would change everything. Mrs. Henderson had never been to a concert in her life, but she was determined to fulfill Robert's promise to Tommy. She spent days calling ticket offices, standing in lines, and even approaching scalpers. The tickets were expensive, more than she spent on groceries in 2 months. But she didn't care. When she finally secured 2 front-row seats, she decided to keep it a surprise. She told Tommy they were going out for dinner, dressed him in his best clothes, and drove toward downtown Memphis. It wasn't until they pulled up to the massive auditorium and Tommy saw the crowds of people and the giant posters of Elvis that he began to understand what was happening. His eyes widened with disbelief as Mrs. Henderson took his hand and led him through the throngs of excited fans. "Your father wanted you to see this," she said gently, her own eyes filling with tears. "He saved money for months, and he made me promise that if anything ever happened to him, I would make sure you got to see Elvis perform." For the first time since his father's death, Tommy showed emotion, but instead of joy, his face crumpled with pain. The reality of why he was there, because his father was gone, hit him like a physical blow. As they took their seats in the front row, Tommy felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. All around him, people were laughing, singing, and sharing their excitement with friends and family. But Tommy felt utterly alone. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. His father should have been there. The opening act took the stage, and the crowd erupted in cheers. Tommy watched with empty eyes, his heart heavy with grief and confusion. Why had Mrs. Henderson brought him here? All it did was remind him of everything he had lost. As the opening act finished and the lights dimmed for the main event, Tommy felt the tears start to flow. They came slowly at first, then more freely as the weight of his loss crashed over him like a wave. Then the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. The lights went completely dark, and a hush fell over the crowd. Then, a single spotlight illuminated the stage, and there he was, Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll himself. The crowd exploded into the loudest cheer Tommy had ever heard. People jumped to their feet, screaming and applauding as Elvis walked to the center of the stage in his iconic white jumpsuit, decorated with rhinestones that caught the light like stars. He was everything Tommy had imagined and more. Tall, charismatic, and radiating a presence that commanded attention. Elvis raised his hand, and somehow, miraculously, 15,000 people fell silent. His voice boomed through the speakers as he greeted his fans with that famous smile. "Thank you. Thank you very much," he said, his words echoing through the venue. "It's good to be back in Memphis, y'all." The crowd roared again, but Tommy barely heard them. He was transfixed by the man on stage, remembering all those evenings spent listening to his records with his father. Robert's voice echoed in his memory. "That's the king, son. There'll never be another like him." Elvis began his set with "That's All Right," and the entire auditorium became electric with energy. But for Tommy, each song was like a knife to his heart. These were the songs he and his father had shared. When Elvis transitioned into "Love Me Tender," Tommy completely broke down. This had been his father's favorite song, the one Robert would hum while working on Cars, the one that always made him smile no matter how tired he was. Tommy buried his face in his hands and sobbed, his small body shaking with grief that he had been holding inside for months. Mrs. Henderson noticed his distress and put her arm around him, trying to offer comfort. But Tommy was lost in his pain, overwhelmed by the cruel irony of finally being at an Elvis concert without the person who had made it possible. The people around them began to notice the crying child in the front row. Some looked concerned, others whispered among themselves, wondering what was wrong. But Tommy was oblivious to their attention, consumed by his own sorrow. Elvis Presley had performed for millions of people throughout his career. He had seen every kind of audience reaction imaginable, but as he moved across the stage during "Love Me Tender," something caught his attention that made him stop mid-verse. In the front row, directly in his line of sight, sat a small boy who wasn't cheering or singing along like everyone else. The child was crying, not the happy tears of an overwhelmed fan, but deep, heartbroken sobs that even from the stage, Elvis could see were coming from a place of profound pain. Elvis had always prided himself on his connection with his audience, but this was different. This wasn't about entertaining a crowd. This was about one small boy who was clearly suffering. Without missing a beat, Elvis continued singing, but his eyes kept returning to Tommy. Something about the scene tugged at Elvis's heart in a way that few things ever had. Looking at Tommy, he saw something of himself, a soul in need of healing, of connection, of hope. As the song reached its final notes, Elvis made a decision that would change both his life and Tommy's forever. In his entire career, Elvis Presley had never stopped a concert mid-performance to address an individual audience member. But looking down at Tommy's tear-stained face, Elvis felt something more powerful than professionalism. He felt compassion.
The song ended, and instead of moving into his next number, Elvis set down his microphone and walked to the edge of the stage. The crowd, sensing something unusual was happening, began to quiet down. A murmur of confusion rippled through the auditorium. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elvis said, his voice carrying clearly through the venue, "I need to take a moment here." The silence that followed was deafening. 15,000 people held their breath, wondering what was happening. Elvis pointed toward Tommy, his voice gentle but strong enough for everyone to hear. "I see a young man down here in the front row who seems to be carrying some heavy feelings tonight." All eyes turned to Tommy, who looked up at Elvis through his tears, hardly believing that the king of rock and roll was talking about him. "Son," Elvis said, speaking directly to Tommy now, "would you mind if I came down there to talk to you for a minute?" What happened next would be talked about for decades to come. Elvis Presley, in the middle of a sold-out concert, stepped down from the stage and made his way to the front row where Tommy sat. The crowd was stunned into silence. People pulled out cameras, knowing they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that would never happen again. Elvis approached Tommy with gentle steps, his rhinestone jumpsuit catching the stage lights. When he reached the boy, he knelt down so they were at eye level, his famous face kind and concerned. "What's your name, son?" Elvis asked softly, though his voice was picked up by the microphones. "Tommy," the boy managed to whisper. "Tommy," Elvis repeated. "That's a good, strong name. Tell me, Tommy, what's got you so sad tonight?" For a moment, Tommy couldn't speak. Mrs. Henderson leaned forward and whispered something in Elvis's ear, explaining about Tommy's father, about the accident, about the promise that had brought them here tonight. Elvis listened intently as Mrs. Henderson briefly explained Tommy's story. His expression shifted from curiosity to understanding to deep compassion as he learned about Robert Richardson's death and about the boy's struggle with grief. When Mrs. Henderson finished speaking, Elvis nodded solemnly and turned back to Tommy. The entire auditorium remained silent, hanging on every word. "Tommy," Elvis said, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed to wrap around the boy like a blanket. "I want you to know that your daddy is here tonight. He's here in your heart, in your memories, and in the love he gave you. And I have a feeling he's mighty proud of you right now." Tommy looked up at Elvis through his tears, searching the man's face for some sign of truth, some comfort that could ease the pain he had been carrying. "You know," Elvis continued, "I lost my mama when I was young too. The people we love never really leave us. They live on in the music we share, in the stories we tell, and in the dreams we chase. Your daddy's dream was for you to hear this music, to feel the joy it brings. Don't you think he'd want you to smile tonight?" Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Tommy nodded. For the first time since his father's death, he felt a tiny spark of something that might have been hope. Elvis reached into his pocket and pulled out a small white handkerchief. Gently, he wiped the tears from Tommy's cheeks, his touch as tender as a father's. "Now, Tommy," Elvis said with a smile that could light up the darkest room, "I've got an idea. How would you like to help me with the next song?" Tommy's eyes widened with surprise. "Me?" he whispered. "You," Elvis confirmed. "See, I was going to sing Can't Help Falling in Love, but I have a feeling it would sound better with a little help from a friend. What do you say?" The crowd began to murmur with excitement, realizing they were about to witness something truly special. Tommy looked at Mrs. Henderson, who nodded encouragingly, tears streaming down her own face. "I don't know the words very well," Tommy admitted quietly. Elvis chuckled. "Son, that song isn't about knowing all the words perfectly. It's about feeling the music in your heart. And I have a feeling your heart knows this song better than you think." With that, Elvis stood and extended his hand to Tommy. "Come on up on stage with me, partner. Let's give your daddy the concert he always wanted you to have." What followed was perhaps the most touching moment in the history of live performance. Tommy, his small hand dwarfed by Elvis's larger one, walked onto the stage with the king of rock and roll. The crowd erupted in applause, warm, appreciative applause of people witnessing something beautiful and real. Elvis guided Tommy to the center of the stage, where two microphones stood waiting. He adjusted the second microphone to Tommy's height and then addressed the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen," Elvis announced, "I'd like you to meet my new friend,
Tommy Richardson. Tonight, we're going to sing a song for his daddy, who's watching from heaven. The crowd responded with another wave of gentle applause, and Tommy felt something he hadn't experienced in months. He felt like he belonged somewhere. Elvis positioned himself next to Tommy and nodded to his band. The familiar opening notes of Can't Help Falling in Love filled the auditorium, and Elvis began to sing in his rich, unmistakable voice. Wise men say, only fools rush in. At first, Tommy just listened, mesmerized. But as the song continued, Elvis gently encouraged him to join in. As the song progressed, something magical happened. Tommy's voice, pure and sweet, despite his earlier tears, began to blend with Elvis's in a harmony that sent chills through the entire auditorium. The crowd listened in respectful silence, many wiping away tears of their own. Elvis, the consummate performer, could have easily overshadowed the small boy beside him. Instead, he adjusted his volume and style to complement Tommy's voice, creating a duet that was both professional and deeply personal. Shall I stay? Would it be a sin if I can't help falling in love with you? As they sang together, Tommy felt something shift inside him. The crushing weight of grief that had been pressing down on him for months began to lift, just slightly. He could almost hear his father's voice joining in, could almost feel Robert's presence beside him on that stage. The song reached its crescendo, and both voices rose together in perfect harmony. As the final notes faded away, the silence that followed was profound. Then, slowly the applause began, building into a thunderous ovation that lasted several minutes. Tommy stood on that stage, overwhelmed by the response from the crowd, but more importantly, overwhelmed by a feeling of peace that he hadn't experienced since his father's death. For the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about what he had lost. He was thinking about what he had gained. Elvis knelt down beside him again. "How do you feel, son?" Elvis asked. Tommy thought for a moment, then smiled, the first genuine smile that had crossed his face in months. "I feel like my daddy heard us," he said simply. Elvis's own eyes filled with tears at the boy's words. "I believe he did, Tommy. I believe he did." The applause finally began to die down, and Elvis stood to address the audience once more. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "sometimes music does more than entertain us. Sometimes it heals us, connects us, and reminds us of what's truly important in life. Tonight, Tommy reminded me why I do what I do." He put his hand on Tommy's shoulder. "Tommy, would you like to stay up here with me for the rest of the show?" Tommy looked out at the sea of faces, all smiling at him with warmth and acceptance, and nodded eagerly. What followed was unlike any concert Elvis had ever performed. With Tommy by his side, he continued through his set list, but everything felt different, more intimate, more meaningful, more connected to the real purpose of music. Tommy didn't sing every song, but he stayed on stage, sometimes swaying to the music, sometimes just watching in wonder as Elvis performed. The crowd loved every minute of it, responding to each song with enthusiasm while maintaining a special affection for the small boy who had become an unexpected part of the show. During Hound Dog, Tommy actually began to dance a little, his natural childlike rhythm bringing smiles to faces throughout the auditorium. Elvis, delighted by the boy's emerging joy, encouraged him with winks and gestures that made Tommy giggle. When Elvis performed Don't Be Cruel, he dedicated it to all the daddies out there who love their children enough to share their dreams with them. The crowd understood the reference and responded with appreciative applause. As the concert neared its end, Elvis made an announcement that surprised everyone, including his own band. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to close tonight with a song that wasn't on our original set list, but it feels like the right way to end this very special evening. This is for Tommy, for his daddy Robert, and for everyone who believes in the power of love and music to heal our hearts." The opening chords of "Love Me Tender" filled the auditorium once again, the same song that had caused Tommy to break down earlier. But this time, instead of tears of grief, Tommy felt tears of gratitude and peace. Elvis began the song alone, his voice tender and filled with emotion. But as the first verse ended, he gestured for Tommy to join him. This time, Tommy didn't hesitate. His young voice, clear and confident now, blended with Elvis's in a rendition that was both heartbreaking and healing. As they sang together, Mrs. Henderson watched from her seat, tears streaming down her face. She knew that Robert would have been so proud to see his son up there, sharing the stage with his hero, finding his voice again after months of silence. The song ended with both voices holding the final note together. As the music faded, Elvis swept Tommy up in a big hug, lifting him off his feet as the crowd erupted in the loudest applause of the entire evening. As the concert officially ended, Elvis walked Tommy back to where Mrs. Henderson was waiting. The crowd was reluctant to leave, many still processing what they had witnessed. Elvis knelt down to Tommy's level one final time. From his pocket he pulled out a small silver pendant, a lightning bolt, his personal symbol. "Tommy," he said, placing the pendant in the boy's small hand, "I want you to have this. Whenever you miss your daddy, whenever you feel alone, I want you to remember tonight. Remember that you've got music in your soul, and music never leaves us. It connects us to the people we love, no matter where they are." Tommy clutched the pendant tightly, looking up at Elvis with eyes that now shone with hope instead of despair. "Will I see you again?" Tommy asked. Elvis smiled. "Son, every time you hear music, every time you sing, every time you remember this night, you'll see me. And more importantly, you'll see your daddy. Music makes us immortal, Tommy. Don't ever forget that." That night changed everything for Tommy Richardson. He returned home with Mrs. Henderson, but he was a different child than the one who had left earlier that evening. The crushing grief was still there, but it had been joined by something else. Hope, purpose, and a connection to something larger than his own pain. Tommy kept Elvis's pendant with him always, and true to the king's words, whenever he felt alone he would hold it and remember that magical night when music had healed his broken heart. Years later, Tommy Richardson would become a music teacher, dedicating his life to sharing the power of song with children who, like him, needed healing. He would often tell his students about the night Elvis Presley taught him that music doesn't just entertain, it connects, it heals, and it keeps our loved ones alive in our hearts forever. The concert that night lasted about 2.5 hours, but its impact would last a lifetime. For Tommy, for Mrs. Henderson, for Elvis himself, and for the 15,000 people who witnessed something extraordinary. A reminder that sometimes the most powerful moments happen not when everything goes according to plan, but when love and compassion take center stage.